Welcome to this explainer on NEC Article 240. You know, if you've ever stared at a dense codebook and literally felt a headache coming on, well, you're absolutely in the right place. We're going to translate these heavy, complex regulations into a tactical survival guide. So, whether you're gearing up to conquer the 2023 NEC exam, or you just want to make sure you're applying the code perfectly and safely out in the field, this explainer is your blueprint.
Okay, let's just dive right into our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the overcurrent threat, standard ratings and sizing up, small conductor hard limits, navigating the TAP rules, and finally, deadly exam traps.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the overcurrent threat. So, overcurrent. It's any current in excess of the rated current of equipment or the ampacity of a conductor. But here's the crucial thing to remember. Overcurrent is really an umbrella term. It covers both your slow-burning overload, like when someone plugs way too many space heaters into a single wall outlet, and it also covers a catastrophic instantaneous short circuit or ground fault. Telling these apart is fundamental, and honestly, it trips people up on the test all the time. An overload isn't going to melt your wires in a split second, but a short circuit, yeah, that absolutely will.
And that perfectly illustrates our primary defense mechanisms against these threats. We basically have two main heroes here: fuses and circuit breakers. Notice the massive contrast. Fuses are typically one and done, one-time use devices. Although sure, you might see dual element or time delay fuses used specifically for things like motor starting. Circuit breakers, on the other hand, are resettable. But here is the absolutely critical NEC rule you gotta know. Circuit breakers must be trip-free. That means you literally cannot physically hold a breaker handle closed to stop it from tripping during a fault. It's gonna trip internally to save the circuit anyway. And of course, both of these devices must have an adequate interrupting rating, or AIC, to interrupt that fault current without blowing themselves to pieces.
Moving right along to Section 2, Standard Ratings and Sizing Up.
Now, instead of just staring at a giant wall of numbers in the codebook, look at how we've grouped these standard OCPD, or overcurrent protective device sizes. You've got your everyday residential sizes from 15 to 100 amps, your mid-range stuff from 110 to 800 amps, and then those massive commercial sizes scaling all the way from 1,000 up to 6,000 amps. You really need to be familiar with these specific buckets to quickly solve field scenarios and nail those exam calculations.
But let's look at a real-world problem. What happens if your calculated conductor ampacity doesn't perfectly match one of these standard breaker sizes? Just imagine, you're on a job site, you're staring at a conductor rated for exactly 95 amps. But you look in the back of your truck, and standard breakers only come in 90 amp or 100 amp sizes. What do you do?
Well, this brings us to what is basically every electrician's favorite loophole, the next size up rule, found in 240.4b. This rule actually permits you to jump up to the next higher standard rating, like slapping that 100 amp breaker on your 95 amp wire, but only if you meet three very strict conditions. First, the OCPD has to be 800 amps or less. Second, the conductor cannot be part of a multi-outlet branch circuit. And third, it can't be supplying specific loads listed in 240.4g, like AC or heat pump equipment, because those have their own special sizing rules.
Now, I want you to pay very close attention to this massive number right here. 800 amps. This is the absolute hard cap for utilizing that next size up rule. If your protective device needs to go to 801 amps, bam, that loophole instantly slams shut. So seriously, keep that number locked in your memory.
All right, Section 3, small conductor hard limits.
Go ahead and take a mental screenshot of this, because for 14, 12, and 10 AWG copper conductors, these overcurrent protection limits are absolute hard caps. 14 gauge is permanently capped at 15 amps, 12 gauge at 20 amps, and 10 gauge at 30 amps. And here's why this matters so much. You literally cannot exceed these limits regardless of what your ampacity adjustment or temperature correction math tells you. So even if a 14 AWG THN wire is technically rated for 25 amps in the 90-degree column, it doesn't matter. Its overcurrent protection is strictly capped at 15 amps. No way around it.
Actually, scratch that. There is one way around it. There's always an exception in the NEC, right? The only time you get a free pass to ignore those small conductor hard limits is when you're dealing specifically with motor circuits calculated under Article 430. Motors have these massive starting inrush currents, so the code actually allows us to oversize the short circuit protection just to get the motor spinning. But outside of that very specific application, do not mess with those small conductor limits.
Let's shift gears into Section 4, navigating the TAP rules.
This translates some incredibly dense code into clean, actionable rules.
Now, a tap is essentially just splicing a smaller wire into a larger feeder without putting a breaker right at the splice point. For a 10-foot tap, the tap conductor's ampacity has to be at least 10% of the feeder's overcurrent device rating. For a 25-foot tap, it bumps up. It must be at least 1/3 of the feeder's rating, plus it needs physical protection from damage. But look at the unifying rule here. Whether you're pulling a 10-foot or 25-foot tap, both absolutely must terminate in a single overcurrent protective device. That single breaker or set of fuses is the whole shebang when it comes to safely limiting the load on that tap.
And finally, Section 5, Deadly Exam Traps. Okay, trap number 1. You're taking the test, you see a question about a 1000-amp circuit, and they practically beg you to use the next size up rule. The fact? As we just discussed, the rule does not apply above 800 amps. When you see a massive circuit like that, that next size up loophole vanishes. You must strictly protect that conductor at or below its allowable ampacity. So if your wire is only good for 1100 amps, there is no way you're using a 1200 amp breaker. You'd have to drop down to a 1000 amp breaker or run more wire.
Trap number 2. Slapping a 20-amp breaker on a 14 AWG wire because your temperature derating calculations looked really favorable. The fact here, 14 AWG is always limited to a 15-amp maximum OCPD. Test makers absolutely love to trick you with this. They'll have you calculate the ampacity of a 14-gauge wire in, say, a freezing cold room, making it look mathematically like it can easily handle 20 amps. Do not fall for it. The code strictly limits it to 15 amps, period.
Trap number 3. A test question simply states a 10-foot tap only needs 10% ampacity of the feeder, and it just leaves it at that. The fact? Yes, the 10% math is technically correct, but it must also terminate in a single OCPD that limits the load. The crucial point is that doing the 10% math is the easy part, but people constantly forget that second, mandatory requirement of terminating the tap in a single device.
Trap number 4. Trying to use supplementary devices as your primary protection. The fact is, supplementary overcurrent protective devices, which are defined in 240.10, do not qualify as branch circuit protection. So don't let an internal equipment fuse, like a tiny little glass fuse inside a piece of machinery or lighting fixture, don't let that fool you. The NEC makes it explicitly clear that those supplementary devices absolutely do not replace the required branch circuit breaker sitting back in your main panel board. Which leaves us with a final thought to really test your mastery of this explainer. You might know the theory well enough to pass a multiple-choice test, but consider this real-world scenario. If an 800-amp breaker trips while protecting a 10-foot tap, do you know exactly which NEC rule you just violated? Think about the tap rules we just covered, and think about the sheer size of that breaker sending current down a tap wire. It's a puzzle that really separates the novices from the masters. Keep digging into Article 240, stay safe out there, and we'll see you in the next explainer.